That's the cutest fucking thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a pre-release analysis on Nahida. As usual, a lot of it is subject to change. If you're basing your decision on whether or not to pull on how strong the unit is, make sure you tune into my stream or watch my post-release video, which I will release before Nahida's banner is gone. Don't rush into it if you're pulling strictly for strength. If you're pulling because you like the character, go right ahead, I won't stop you. But if it is for strength, wait until there's been actual testing done. Very pog. As usual, I'm using Project Amber. You'll find the link in the description. Let's just get right into it. Low base HP, low base defense, normal 5-star base attack, elemental mastery, Ascension stat. Now, the low base HP and low base defense actually do matter because I think that Nahida's best role is likely going to be on-field driver. And on-field drivers are on-field, so if they're susceptible to dying, that kind of sucks. It does mean that it might be a little bit more frustrating to play because you're a little bit more vulnerable to just getting one-shot by things. She's a catalyst user, which means that her normal attacks are just Dendro stuff. Her normal attack animations are actually like really fast compared to a lot of the other catalysts. She has a normal charge attack thing that costs 50. Scaling on it is, if anything, a little bit below average. Scaling on the normal attack, very much the same. So her normal attacks aren't that good. Her charge attack is expensive. You don't have a mechanic inside the talent that reduces stamina consumption of charge attack. You don't have a talent like Ascension or Constellation that reduces it either, so you're always gonna have to pay 50 stamina for your charge attacks, which is unfortunate because her charge attacks do not share internal cooldown with her normal attacks, which means that if what you're trying to do is apply Dendro as quickly as possible, you're likely going to want to be doing some combination of normal and charge attacks, and when they cost 50, it's a pain in the ass. Because of that, even though her optimal combos are pretty likely going to include charge attacks, I think most of the time you just won't use them. Because her normal attacks are so quick, then at the very least, it doesn't feel like shit to use only those. But yeah, they have a pretty small AoE, right? It's like I guess it is kind of similar to Yai's charge attacks in terms of AoE. It doesn't go as far, so the range is lower, but the way that the AoE works is very similar to Yai's charge attacks, I would say. And you have an okay-ish AoE for a normal attack for Catalyst users, but it's really like nothing crazy. Most of the time your normal attacks are going to be single target. There is a lot of value in her normal attacks because of her element, but her normal attacks like by themselves don't really do anything special, so we'll move on to the rest of her kit and we'll come back to what you can do with the element later on. Her E sends forth karmic bonds of wood and tree from her side, dealing AoE Dendro damage and marking opponent's hit with the seed of Skandha. I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sorry. When held, this skill will trigger differently. Hold enters aiming mode, which allows you to select a limited number of opponents within a limited area. During this time, Nahida's resistance to interruption will be increased. When released, this skill deals Dendro damage to these opponents and marks them with the seed of Skandha. Aiming will last up to 5 seconds and can select a maximum of 8 opponents. So, in other words, you can use your E. It looks like the size of the AoE is very similar to like Razor Hold E. Right? Around that, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit bigger, it's hard to tell, but something around that size. It deals AoE, deals damage around you, that's the tap. And then the hold is you basically enter some sort of aiming mode. You'll have like a square around your aiming mode, and any enemy that's in the square, once you release it, will get the mark. Any enemy that has entered the square before you release it will also get. So what you can do is you can just go in aiming mode, flick, and this is gonna apply it in an arc in front of you with a very large range. Effectively, the main conclusion from this is that she has decent size AoE, but if the enemies are really, really far from each other, you do this and the whole room has the mark. So she effectively has a pseudo unlimited size on her AoE from the skill itself. Now, once you hit them with the skill, they're affected by the seed. And effectively, enemies that have that mark, it works kind of a lot like Yoimiya, where if you hit them, it deals damage. Except it's not if you hit them, it's if you trigger a reaction on them. So if you trigger a reaction on an enemy that has the seed, it deals Dendro damage. But it doesn't just deal Dendro damage to the enemy you triggered a reaction on, it deals Dendro damage to all of the linked enemies, all of the enemies that you hit with your E. This basically means that Nahida is going to be one of the best units at consolidating AoE. It's going to be really easy to make sure that Nahida's hitting all of the enemies with her E. It's basically going to be trivial. You just hold your E, and then all the enemies are linked for 20 seconds, which is nice. But yeah, so when you trigger a reaction, it deals the damage. It's not just when you trigger a reaction, it's also when, for example, the Hyperbloom seeds deal damage, because you trigger a reaction, let's say you trigger Hyperbloom, and then like 0.5 seconds later, the seed hits the enemy, right? right? Because it has a travel time. So because of that part, it basically gives you more leeway when it comes to the time window that you have to trigger your reaction. It has a delay. You can only trigger it up to once every 1.9 seconds. The thing about this is it's not actually going to be once every 1.9 seconds. This is something that you'll notice if you've played Albedo, you've played Yoimiya. It's not actually once per this period of time, because if you trigger it at 1.89, it doesn't do anything. And it's hard to make it so that you trigger it exactly every 1.9. So while this is the theoretical maximum, realistically, it's more going to be every 2.1, maybe even 2.2 seconds. It's not always going to be this number though, because her burst has an effect that can reduce the trigger interval. So the way that her burst works is it creates a very large field, and while you're within that field, Nahida's E gains bonus effects. There is also a passive talent that gives you, when you use your burst, that gives your active character 20% of the EM of the highest, of the party member with the highest EM, up to 200. But these are the only two effects that her burst has. It's the effects that buff her E, and the effect that gives your active character elemental mastery. Her burst by itself doesn't do anything. So, what are the things that it changes with on your skill? It has 3 different things it can do. It can increase the damage of your skill, reduce the trigger interval of your skill, and last longer. It doesn't make your skill last longer, it just means that the field stays for longer, which means that if you also have lower trigger interval, you get those trigger interval for a longer duration, and you get this elemental mastery buff for a longer duration. You're not always going to get these buffs though. The way that the buffs work is depending on what other party members you have, you'll get some buffs. The pyro buff, so when you have a pyro character on your team, it gives your E 20% damage. As far as we understand, this is damage percent, so it's like a 6-7% DPS increase on your E. If you're on field, you're Nahida, your E is only a part of your damage, so it's even smaller of a DPS increase. The real good one is this one. The trigger interval being decreased means that instead of every 1.9, if you have 1 electro, you can trigger it every 1.6 seconds. If you have 2 electros, it can be every 1.45 seconds. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is each point of Nahida's elemental mastery beyond 200 will grant a 0.1% bonus damage and 0.03% crit rate to Trikarma Purification. Basically, her E gains more damage percent and crit based on her EM. They did the same thing with Nahida as they did with Raiden. They gave her a somewhat convoluted C1 that feels like it's doing a lot, but basically doesn't do anything. In almost every team where you play Nahida, you'll run at least 1 electro unit. So at most, it's making you gain 0.15 seconds on your E, which is okay. Like, it's not bad, but it's nothing crazy. Damage percent, this isn't 20% more damage, this is 20% more damage percent, and you're already getting so much damage percent because you're gaining up to 80% from this. And then the duration of your burst, it's already lasting long enough. It has a 50 energy cost, really low cooldown, fine duration. So her C1 is like a thing that it's overly convoluted to make it look better than it is, just like the Resolve C1 on Raiden, so that if you go for C1 because you don't know better, and then you learn that the C2 is good, then you'll go for C2. If you accidentally pull for C1, it's not going to feel like you got anything meaningful, but it is going to feel like you're halfway there to C2. So it's basically, constellations like this are basically just a bait for you to swipe to get you the C2. But the C2 is good. It makes your Dendro transformative reactions able to crit with a set 20% crit chance and 100% crit damage, and it makes it so that Quicken, Aggravate, and Spread reduces defense by 30%. This is a good constellation, but as usual, it doesn't change gameplay. It's just more damage. If that's what you want, I'm not going to stop you, but just make sure that you have enough Primogems to go for the characters that you want after Nahida as well. Especially after the fucking endgame news, like, they're not going to make it real endgame. You're not going to need your characters to be strong. All you're doing by going for constellations like this is you're speedrunning how quickly you get bored with the game because enemies get too squishy for you. But yeah, C3 is okay, because basically all of her damage is her E. C4 is meh. C5 is fine-ish. Makes you go from like 1.45, it's 0.8 seconds, to 1.37? Actually, that's kind of shit. Never mind, I take it back, it's not good. When Nahida hits an opponent affected by... Oh yeah, her C6 is good. It's kind of like Ilan C6, but AoE. After using your burst, when you hit an enemy that's affected by E, it'll do damage for up to 6 attacks. It's just another one of those, like, ooh, you can make your character do so much more meaningless damage if you just give us $1,000. All in all, above average constellations for sure, but as usual, fuck constellations. Alright! Nahida has just received a few bursts, or nuffs. What she received is things that look like nerfs, but in most situations end up being buffs. The first important change is that we are now at 2.5 second trigger interval for the E, right? So it's slower. However, a change that is not reflected on this page is her E no longer has ICD, which means it can apply Dendro on every hit. The second change is that it lasts longer, 25 seconds instead of 20 seconds. The third change is they changed the numbers for the burst. At level 10, it used to be 30% on 2 characters, now it's 40%. It used to be 0.45 on 2 characters, now it's 0.67, and it used to be 6, now it's 9. Effectively, they just made the burst a little bit more impactful for all 3 of the different buffs. And then finally, another change that is not reflected here is the elemental mastery of the active character. Instead of 20%, it's 25%, and instead of max 200, it's max 250. So I'm going to be going through the changes and really how it impacts her strength. The most significant change by far is the way that her E works, removing the internal cooldown and making it a little bit slower. The direct consequence is that she will do a bit less talent damage, but more reaction damage. So without any sort of reactions, we're looking at around 6k DPS. However, that's not the only thing, because you're also getting spreads. There we go. We're approaching about around 10k DPS. This is pre-buff, okay? Actually though, we're looking at off-field, so you don't actually get her own... Sorry, it's closer to this. Now if we look at post-buff, so what's changing is basically the amount of times you'll proc your E. And instead of it being 9, it's going to be 8 limit, more realistically closer to 7, but you're getting more spreads. The actual damage is basically the same. Very small buff. However, this is without... Yeah, this is assuming you don't actually use your burst, so you don't actually get the bonuses from burst. When you actually do activate burst, or the cooldown would have gone from 1.9 to 1.45, which is like a ceiling of up to 14, but more realistically, it's going to be something like 11 or 12. We're going to be nice. We're going to assume 12. Right, so this is with double electro. Right, so with double electro, this goes to 12 of them. Now on 12, you will be getting 7 spreads. Now post birth, instead of every 1.45, it's every 1.83, which is a hard cap of 11. More realistically, it's going to be something like 9 or 10. We can look at 9. So we're optimistic for pre-birth and pessimistic for post-birth. And even with such things, we're still getting a slight increase. So in off-field Quicken, she is getting a slight increase. For on-field, it's going to be a slightly bigger increase because they did buff the amount of elemental mastery you gain from her passive, which means that it is basically the same damage you're getting, or the same damage difference you're getting from your E, but on top of that, you're getting a little bit more elemental mastery, so it's a bit more of a buff. The basic TLDR for this, though, is that it's not a significant buff. And if you're not triggering Quicken, it is actually quite a big nerf to her personal damage. However, if you're not triggering Quicken, or if you're not maintaining Quicken, if you're not getting a lot of spreads, but you're still applying more Dendro, and more Dendro means more of the other reactions. You're generating more Bloom Seeds, for example. So, if we look at the baseline stuff, you're losing around 25%. The actual number you're losing is going to vary basically between 20 and 30, but in exchange, you're getting, instead of 10 spreads to 7 spreads, you're getting 10 Dendro applications for Bloom instead of 7 Dendro applications for Bloom. So, even though her personal damage will actually be taking a hit, you can get up to 6 additional seeds. Technically, it could be 9, realistically. It's more going to be something like about 4 to 5 additional seeds generated per rotation. 4 to 5 additional seeds generated per rotation is 4 to 5 more Hyperblooms, and even just 4 more Hyperblooms. Hyperbloom base damage, 43, 41. Your elemental mastery multiplier, let's say you're using an electro unit that will trigger it, you can get, for example, EM Raiden, right? 221 from Dragon's Bane, 187 times 3 from your artifacts. Main stats, 230 from the Gilded Dream set, maybe around 100 to 120 from substats. Damage is going to be... So one Hyperbloom is 1.6k DPS, just one more per rotation. And you're getting 4 to 5, which is about 6k more per rotation. Now, Nahida's damage goes down by about 1.4k, 1.5k, but the team DPS, in exchange for that, gets an additional 6.4k. Balances out to about 5k more. Which means that less of your damage will be coming from Nahida in Hyperbloom teams, but because you're getting more seeds, your team DPS does go up. By a pretty significant amount, actually. This is a pretty big difference. Now, when it comes to on-field Hyperbloom, though, that additional Dendro app won't actually necessarily make more seeds because you already have so much. So what it's doing is it's giving Nahida a bit more spreads. Right, when you play a Hyperbloom team normally for on-field Nahida, unfortunately we're starting to get into situations where there's a lot more assumptions, a lot more different stuff, so we have to use like in-depth sheet. But basically, you're getting less E procs, but you're getting more spreads from your E and normal attacks. From what I've calculated, it's basically looking like her personal damage will be mostly the same, but because you have slightly higher Dendro app, you're relatively likely to get more Hyperblooms. Overall, let's go through her like main archetypes that we had. For on-field Quicken, small buff. For off-field Quicken, very small buff. For on-field Hyperbloom, small buff. For off-field Hyperbloom, big buff. In Nilo teams, her faster applications actually means that she's going to get less ownership of blooms, but that you will be generating more blooms in exchange. Overall, it should end up being a buff. Not entirely sure how big of a buff it will be. In Burgeon teams, it will just be a straight buff, and a pretty nice one at that. And in Burning teams, it is actually a very significant buff. You basically go from needing to be careful with your application to actually being able to get good application and still get a bunch of burning stuff. The fact that it's 1.5U Dendro is just so valuable when it comes to burning, because it means that the burning will last longer. It means that it's going to be a lot easier to keep it going, even if you're using her in conjunction with something like Ganyu. It wouldn't surprise me if it was possible to use Ganyu and use her burst with Nahida burning teams. This is, I don't know, later Zajef, who watched the like edited version of the video and realized there were a few things missing, so let's get right into them. First off is about burning. I didn't fully understand one thing about burning. I thought that there was a mechanic that would work when it does not. When you refresh burning duration, you don't actually re-trigger burning, which means that your burning aura doesn't get refreshed. It's only your Dendro aura that gets refreshed, which means the like burning synergy with Ganyu and Ayaka, they might be a bit harder to make work properly than I thought they would be, because you're gonna need to make sure that your cryo application isn't happening too quickly, because if it is, then you kind of just cry. That being said, you'll still be able to use burning teams with Nahida plus an off-field pyro unit, so like Nahida Sailing, and that won't be a problem. It's just for specifically like Nahida no pyro, or like Nahida Bennett or something, right, where you don't have an off-field pyro. That's gonna be difficult. Basically what ends up happening is, because there's always longer than a 2-second delay between Ganyu's charge shots, that means that you'll always have an underlying aura that is higher than 0.5 units of pyro. That means that if you deplete the burning gauge with your reaction, well, it's gonna proc Nahida's E, so you're gonna get a Dendro app, and because you didn't remove all of your pyro, it's gonna re-trigger burning. Which means that for Ganyu specifically, because there's a larger than 2.5 second delay between her charge shots, and so that means you can consistently get Nahida's E to reapply on every charge shot. With Ganyu specifically, it is going to work with Nahida. With other characters, it might not. But it might not if you use her burst, or if you use stuff like Dauna burst, but yeah. You are going to need a specific setup though, because you're gonna have to make sure that your first Ganyu charge shot is hitting an enemy that is not burning, that just has pyro on them. As long as your Nahida E is still going, you'll be fine. So it should be pretty easy to play in practice once you get the rotation down. I'll have to do some testing on the rotation, but it is going to work for burning, but yeah. Also, I'm kind of for burning load stuff, where you'd be using an off-field pyro and a lot of electro to basically be using the pyro to get a bunch of overloads and a little bit of burning. But because you have so much electro, you're putting out the burning basically instantly, you will be able to keep the quicken on the enemies. And because it's 1.5U, it's going to be even easier to keep the quicken on the enemies, which basically means that you'll be able to do both burning and aggravate on your electro units. It's something that was doable with Dendro MC, but a bit of a pain in the ass, because if you attack the Sea Lotus lamp with pyro, it just goes blue. When it comes to the changes in weapons, it basically didn't change anything. The things that it did change are very, very, very minor. Now, the main reason for that is because you're triggering more reaction, which makes EM better, right? Not really. Because her skill has an EM scaling in and of itself, the EM has a linear scaling for the talent damage, but actually has a pseudo logarithmic, I don't know exactly what to call, it's like, it actually has like real diminishing returns for the spread reaction. It kind of means that the more reactions you trigger, if they're reactions that actually scale with crit, like spread is, the more you actually end up valuing crit and damage percent instead of EM, which is kind of funny, right? More reactions makes you want EM less. Because her EM converts to crit and damage percent, her EM is still very, very valuable. But looking at pre-birth and post-birth, the damage gain from going EM Circlet pre-birth is about 3%, post-birth is about 2.6, which means that the value of EM from her triggering more reactions actually went down a little bit. Because it's a pretty small difference, it hasn't impacted the weapons very much. The main change is that weapons that give attack became worse because attack doesn't scale your spread damage. The reason why damage percent and crit are still very, very good with more reactions is because they spread your spread damage on top of your talent damage. But attack does not, so attack just ends up being even worse, which makes weapons like Scoured Atlas, Memory of Dust, even worse than they were before. Artifact sets didn't change much. You're still generally going to want Deepwood if you don't have another Deepwood on your team, and if you do have another Deepwood on your team, you kind of want Gilded Dreams. That being said though, there is one thing that I didn't really mention, and that is that if you're playing her in a Quicken team, because you get so much value from the Gilded Dreams set bonus, going Gilded Dreams versus Deepwood, even if you don't have another character on your team that can go Deepwood, isn't actually that much of a damage loss. If you play any form of Hyperbloom team or Burgeon team or Bloom team, that is not the case. You absolutely want to have a Deepwood on your team. So that's it for the artifact sets. Now for artifact stats, like I said, the value of EM Goblin and Circlet went down a very, very, very tiny minuscule bit. It doesn't matter much. You're still looking at Elemental Mastery or damage percent on your Goblin and Elemental Mastery or crit on your Circlet. Generally, if you're below 1000 EM, the Elemental Mastery main stats will be slightly better, but they are also more rare, which means that your quality might be worse. Don't force an EM main stat if you don't have something that has good substats, but if you do have something that has good substats, consider the option. Try your best never to go over 1000 EM, because once you do, it makes all of the EM that you have over 1000 is a lot less valuable because it doesn't convert to damage percent and crit through her Ascension 4. I think that basically does it for how the changes are going to be impacting her. Oh yeah, actually, wait, no. There's another change I haven't talked about yet. Actually, no, there's two things. So the first thing is the duration of her E went from 20 to 25 seconds, which makes her slightly more synergistic with units like Sino, right? It means that you're not forced to swap out of Sino early in order to have 100% uptime on this. It doesn't affect your Quicken uptime because you'll get Quicken uptime 100% anyways, but it does mean that Nahida keeps doing damage, which is good. Her burst changes basically made it so that it's a bit more worth it to cast her burst. Before the changes, I would have said that because her burst cast time is like 2 seconds, kind of feels shit to use. After the changes, because her burst has a slightly bigger impact, it feels a bit less shit to use. It still feels kind of shit to use if you are going to be on-fielding a character that doesn't care about the Elemental Mastery buff. But if you're playing a character that does care about the Elemental Mastery buff and you want to use your burst, then that makes the burst quite a bit more valuable. Application is important and it matters, but it's most definitely not the only thing that matters. Nahida, unlike an Enderman character, has an actually good Elemental Mastery scaling on her skill. She also has a lower cooldown on it, which means that if you end up on-fielding her, you can, or quick swapping her, you get additional applications every time you press the skill. And then her normal attacks apply Dendro. So if you end up staying on field with her, you can apply a lot of Dendro. In order to really understand how that can be good, where that can be good, why that can be good, we need to really talk about the Dendro archetypes that we have and the archetypes that we don't have yet. First off, the most straightforward, I guess, is Quicken. Just spread and aggravate. When you use her in spread and aggravate, the purpose of your Dendro character is to keep Quicken uptime on the enemy. So that's where the application is important. And the other part in Quicken team where application is important is because that's what decides how often you spread, and so how often you do spread damage. So in Quicken teams, slow app doesn't matter if damage is good anyways. Now for Hyperbloom teams. Hyperbloom teams are the ones where Dendro application matters a lot, because you're gonna have relatively bad Quicken uptime in your Hyperbloom teams. So you're not getting that much spread, you're not getting that many aggravates. All you care about is getting a lot of seeds. Now, there's a team that I've been playing a lot, which is a double Hydro Hyperbloom team. Can I stop getting hit like a dumbass, please? But another thing that you can notice in a team like this is that I'm auto-attacking on Yelan. Why am I auto-attacking on Yelan? Honestly, there's no real reason for it. The only thing that auto-attacking on Yelan does is that she benefits from on-field buffs, and her Ascension passive is an on-field buff, so she benefits from her passive. Because she's the unit in this team that benefits the most from damage percent, and because she's range, then you end up spending most of your on-field time on her. But it's not because you need to, it's just because you don't really have a unit that cares about being on-field that much. Which means you could have a Dendro unit that wants to be on field. And one thing that you may have noticed is that every time we apply Dendro, basically no matter what in this team, that's about 70,000 damage on Hyperbloom. But if we do Dendro into Hydro, that's 2 seeds, right? They both do 32.5k, 65k damage. And if instead we do Hydro into Dendro, we get 1 seed, okay, cool. But he has a Quicken aura, and then we can get another seed and still get our 2 Hyperblooms. Which means that every Dendro application is 2 Hyperblooms, and your Hyperblooms are doing over 30k damage each. It is possible if you end up having very, 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 very fast Dendro, that you don't actually have enough Hydro to make it so that each app is 2 Hyperblooms, but it's still going to be more than 1 on average. Point being, each instance of Dendro application in Hyperbloom teams can represent 2 Hyperblooms, which will generally be above 30k damage. So, in Hyperbloom, slow app sucks, but you can on-field Nahida. Another nice thing about this team is that basically all of these are replaceable. Sinto's not really replaceable, and you need to have some Dendro. Your Electro unit, you have a lot of choices, and your last unit, it doesn't even need to be a second Hydro. You can go for something else. For your Electro choices, generally Raiden, Kuki, and Yaemiko will be like the 3 general options you want to go for. Fischl can have some value as well, because she has faster Electro, which means that there can be situations where that faster Electro will translate to more seed generation. If you want to know more about that, I have a video on Dendro reactions that you can check out. And then for your last slot, it can honestly be anything. There are other teams. There is Nilo teams. I did publish my Nilo pre-release video today. Nahida does seem to be like the best way to use your Nilo teams, but if you want to know more, honestly, just go watch that video. I'll leave a link in the description. But yeah, so that's kind of it for Bloom teams. Like, you could do Fridge, but Fridge is a meme, so don't do it. So that kind of leaves us with the last thing, which is Burgeon. There's Burgeon teams where you focus on the 3 elements that you need for Burgeon, right? Dendro, Pyro, Hydro. There can be some issues with that, though. For example, right? If you play something like this, you'll apply some Hydro, you'll apply some Dendro, you'll apply some Pyro. Now, when Hydro and Dendro are applied, everything works as intended. You're getting Bloom. But when you apply Pyro, if there's no element on the enemy, everything's good. If there's Hydro on the enemy, everything's good. But if there is Dendro on the enemy when you apply your Pyro, that's going to trigger Burning. Burning is really bad. Because if you trigger Burning, it's going to make it so that your next Hydro application doesn't get a seed, which isn't ideal. That being said, if your Hydro application is fast enough, you can still get away with it. If your Dendro application is fast enough, then losing a seed or 2 won't be the end of the world. The reason why teams like this are pretty fucking terrible right now, in the current version of the game, is because our Dendro applicators are not applying Dendro fast enough to risk losing seed generation because of your burning reactions. With Nahida, it could be. The biggest issue with that is that you have to on-field your Nahida, and if you're on-fielding Nahida, you're not getting AoE Hydro application. Or if you are getting AoE Hydro application, it's pretty slow, like Kokomi. And the thing about Burgeon teams is that the main / only real reason to play Burgeon over Hyperbloom is that Burgeon does AoE damage. But if you're not actually triggering your reactions in AoE, there's just not as much of a reason to play it. I still think these teams can be good. I don't expect them to be nearly as popular and fun to play, or good, as the Hyperbloom versions. That being said, there is a way to make your Burgeon stuff really strong in single target. And that's using an Electro unit. You want an Electro unit that will not be hitting the seeds. And what that ends up doing is you get the interaction of when there's Electro charge on the enemy, you trigger Quicken, so you get 2 seeds still. The Electro is also going to help you weaken the Burning aura, or remove the Burning aura. If I trigger Burning and then attack it with Electro, right, I still got both of my Bloom seeds being generated. In any case, you can use a team like this, where you're using your Electro unit to generate more seeds and help you reduce the amount of time the enemies spend burning, and to trigger some overloads. You're adding some damage on top of it. And it's an Electro unit, so they can do a bunch of damage themselves. You can use teams like these. I don't really have a unit that wants to be spending field time, which means this is another team where you could be using Nahida. So, Burgeon, slow up, ain't great, but you can on-field Nahida. There's a last thing, though. And I am very, very sorry for what I'm about to say. Trust me, okay? I don't want this any more than you do. Let's talk about burning mechanics. Usually, when you apply 1 unit of Pyro, and 1 unit of Dendro, and 2 units of Cryo, enemy keeps burning until there's no more Dendro to burn, and then the aura is gone. If you then reapply Dendro, well, all you have is Dendro. You're not burning anymore. However, if I do it like this, there is still some Pyro left on the enemy, and then if I reapply Dendro, I can keep burning. So what was the difference here? Well, the difference is when Dendro main character's burst explodes from being hit with Pyro, it applies 2 units of Dendro instead of 1. 2 units of Dendro means that your burning lasts for longer. So, how does that apply to Nahida? As of what we currently know from beta, Nahida applies 1.5 units of Dendro. It's a Yelan situation all over again. They ended up changing the way that Yelan works, so just understand that it's very possible they change this 1.5 unit back to 1, but it's also possible they don't. So, we'll talk about the implications of 1.5 unit. What happens if it's 1.5 unit? Now, the decay speed is different. I don't fucking remember the formula for decay rate though, so that's cringe. Yeah, it's 2.5 times gauge plus 7. Burning decay rate is 0.4, which means that you can get just exactly 2 seconds, but because of the way that the exact timing when your number ends up happening, you get 8 ticks and you don't reapply burning. If you apply 1.5 units, instead of being 2, it lasts for 3 seconds, which means that it actually does reapply Pyro. Now, reapplying Pyro means, like I showed here, that you end up with Pyro after the burning is over. And ending up with Pyro after the burning is over means that reapplying Dendro to that keeps the burning going. So, you don't need an off-field Pyro unit to keep the burning going, even if you use some Cryo units to trigger some reactions. Now, will that always work this way? Not quite. If you apply too much Cryo, you will be overtaking. But, at the very least, you can end up using that Dendro application to make your Pyro harder to remove on the enemy, basically, even if you have another off-field Pyro. And so what that means is you can end up playing things like Melt Ganyu with Nahida. Nahida does have some amount of synergy with Ganyu because, well, she gives EM to your on-field characters, and when you play Melt Ganyu, EM is really good. So, burning 1.5U app can create some shenanigans. So now that we've gotten most of the potential things you can do out of the way, let's move on to the builds and shit.